The Ukraine war is in its third year and continues with no real end in sight, and Putin was recently inaugurated for another presidential term. This month, a new round of policies is being debated or implemented as both sides attempt to change their fortunes and create a favorable position in the war. Russian Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Ryabkov, in an interview with TASS last week, stated that the U.S. had long been in an indirect war with Russia and had played with Ukraine in such a way that it allowed the situation to get out of control, and that created the conditions that led to the Ukraine invasion. This is not really a new position, except with the accusation of an indirect war by the U.S. being the center part of the accusation, and lays the blame of the war squarely on the U.S. Rybakov also stated that the U.S. has put itself in a position that is ignoring the risks of escalating the war and continues to push for ever greater support to Ukraine. He indicates that the U.S. is in a position that it can only push for the war to end on its terms, and does not have a roadmap to end the war outside of escalation. Rybakov added that Russia will stop creating red lines for NATO and the U.S. not to cross, but will mirror the behavior of the U.S. and its allies. This last statement by Rybakov is a reference of the push by the U.S., the United Kingdom, and France to remove all restrictions on the use and type of weapons provided to Ukraine. Early in the war, the initial weapons were defensive in nature, but as time went by, that changed to providing offensive-style weapons. However, all had the stipulation that Ukraine were not to use these weapons to attack the Russian homeland. That stipulation appears at an end as France's President Emmanuel Macron, UK Foreign Minister David Cameron, and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken indicating that they support the use of Western weapons can be used however Ukraine decides to use them. The statement of Rybakov of mirroring U.S. and NATO allies is likely a reference to this decision by the West. The U.S. and its G7 allies are discussing the seizure of Russian financial assets to support the war in Ukraine. The G7 froze $300 billion of Russian financial assets due to the war. The U.S. wants these frozen assets seized and used to fund the Ukraine war. The European Union position is that seizing of the assets is illegal, but are open to using the proceeds of interest and dividends to support the war while leaving the assets intact. This is a significant decision, but will not have any impact on the Russian war effort and would be a punitive measure against Putin's allies within Russia. It would also allow the distribution of funds without unanimous consent in the EU or congressional approval in the US. Rybakov's interview with TASS is informative, but should also be viewed with a healthy dose of skepticism. The idea of an indirect war at first glance seems to be a novel view in how the U.S. is involving itself in the war. It can be better described as a proxy war, just as it did in Afghanistan during Soviet occupation, and just as the Soviet Union did against the U.S. in the Korea and Vietnam wars. Rybakov, however, is correct in the Russian difficulty in trying to determine the intent of the U.S., due to the loss of dialogue and diplomatic contact between the two countries starting in 2017. Major General Vadim Skibitsky, the deputy chief of Ukraine's military intelligence directorate, stated that 2024 would be a year that both sides of the conflict would be attempting to get the most favorable battlefield position prior to peace talks happening. As the Russian spring and summer offensive unfold and Western aid starts arriving, it will be a wait and see of which side gets the upper hand on the battlefield that, in Skibitsky's point of view, will determine how a final negotiated settlement will look like for Ukraine.